What up, everybody? It's Derp here with another update on the IronMace versus Nexon court case. Today's video is kind of a two-parter because some news came out just a few hours ago from Korea that I wanted to go over. We got an article from a place called MTN. This is a Korean news agency, and they have some very interesting information. But yeah, make sure to join the conversation on Discord. Check out my Patreon. Every penny I get on Patreon goes in development of my new game. It's a dark fantasy multiplayer online RPG with a lot of dungeon crawler aspects to it, and the upkeep. It also goes to the upkeep of this channel. The legal documents are about $10 or 10 cents a page, and I've gone through about 700 or more pages, so it's starting to add up. But yeah, let's get right into the video. So first things first, the news. There is, as you can tell by the title of this, there's a new restraining order being brought forward against IronMace in Korea. IronMace and Nexon have both petitioned the courts for restraining orders against each other. IronMace's came a while back. Today, Nexon dropped their restraining order against IronMace in Korea. So I've already called out that they would do this in the U.S. I've never openly estimated they would do this in Korea. I, thought it was kind of a no-brainer. Of course, they're going to file a Korean restraining order. But up until now, Nexon has all but ignored IronMace in Korea from a legal standpoint. They're only going after Mr. Choi with criminal cases. Now there's a civil case, again, that's Nexon versus IronMace in the restraining order. There's already been a Korean case of IronMace versus Nexon asking for a restraining order that dropped back when the DMCA dropped in the U.S. All Nexon's efforts have been towards shutting down IronMace's U.S. operations because that's where their largest market is. Now, what happened today kind of changes everything. Before we get into how that might change things, we kind of have to know how things work in Korea. I've already done a video about this, but I want to do a quick summary. The way things work in Korea are pretty similar to how they work in the U.S. with a few exceptions. Korea doesn't work off of common law. I've stated that before in an earlier video. Essentially, it's not really up to the judge's discretion or a jury. It's by the letter of the law. That kind of determines everything. An easy metaphor to use would be a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons. Let's say that in both Korea and the U.S., the judge is the dungeon master. In the U.S., the dungeon master reads the rules and determines the outcome using their own judgment, right? They get to interpret the rules and choose the best course of action, unless there's a jury. Then, if there is a jury, the judge kind of explains the rules to a jury, then the defendant and plaintiff argue it out in front of said jury, and once the jury has enough information, they determine a verdict, and the judge carries out sentencing to the best of their ability, or their own, how they think things should be handled. In Korea, now this is to the best of my knowledge, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a Korean lawyer, I'm not a Korean law expert, but to the best of my knowledge, in Korea, the judge kind of just reads the rules, then determines an outcome based on those rules as they're written, and then carries out a clearly defined sentence, right? There's like a minimum and maximum, but it's a pretty clearly defined sentence. It's a little bit more direct and simplified. Essentially, it's a matter of the judge finding out if the person did whatever illegal action they're accused of. Based on the evidence of the plaintiff, they listen to the arguments of the defendant, and they listen to any information that the investigators or officials can provide. If they have found the defendant guilty, then it carries a sentence of whatever that sentence is, right? There's no jury, there's no real bending the rules, there's no really morality or opinion involved. It's mostly just the letter of the law. Did you do it or did you not is the only real thing that's kind of up to the judge. And then everything else is just kind of standard. With that said, if you want more information about how things do work in Korea, I've went into it a little bit more in depth, and it leads up to where we're at now. So if you want to check out any of the videos that I have linked in the description, please do. I have 4 of them so far. There is the Did IronMace Steal Dark and Darker? My opinions on that. Is Dark and Darker going to get canceled? It's my opinions on that. There's one that kind of goes over who's telling the truth, who's kind of spreading misinformation and who's not. And then my last video of the court timeline, and what's really happening with the Dark and Darker court case. That's my last video. Now that we know how the courts in Korea work, what can we expect, and what are IronMace and Nexon asking for? So before we get into what I think will happen, let's go into what both parties are asking for, because it's difficult to tell how this will play out without a lot more research. And I will probably end up doing an entire video on that subject after I am able to do more research on it. But for now, we do have a little insight into what IronMace and Nexon are asking for because of this news article that came out. So I have the article linked below. And according to MTN, IronMace put forward an injunction or temporary restraining order against Nexon back when Nexon sent out the DMCA notices against them and Dark and Darker, and had Dark and Darker removed from Steam. They want to stop Nexon from obstructing business by blocking the service of Dark and Darker. That's their ask. IM's entire restraining order against Nexon is basically just to get them to leave them alone. They just want to be able to carry out business as normal. This injunction has kind of been in limbo since it was requested. Nothing has been accepted or denied, and that's because, at least to the best of my knowledge, Nexon hasn't filed anything. They literally just waited until the last second to say anything about this, and then it's just kind of taking the time. The court is taking its time. Nexon's allotted a certain amount of days. In Korea, I'm not exactly sure how that is, but it looked like Nexon was almost about to just say nothing. And it looks like the Korean courts were kind of content in dragging out the decision, at least until they heard back from Nexon. And then they had 2 minutes left or whatever to file their response, and they did today. And that changed everything. So Nexon finally answered IronMace's temporary restraining order, or injunction is the legal term for it, with an injunction of their own. They responded, and what they're asking for, according to MTN News, is basically please ban IronMace from directly conducting the services of Dark and Darker in Korea. They want an immediate stoppage to all Dark and Darker services in Korea. So they can't work on anything related to Dark and Darker in Korea at all. And the following is a translation directly from the article. According to the legal community, on the 15th, the Suwon District Court will hold a hearing on provisional injunction mutually filed by Nexon and IronMace on the 21st. It's highly likely that the date held on this day will be the final date. It is confirmed that the due date will no longer be held. The claim of both sides will be collected on a conclusion regarding the provisional injunction will be made at the end of July at the earliest, or in August at the latest. If Nexon's claim is cited in both provisional injunctions, it will be difficult for IronMace to continue as a corporation. This is because it's not easy to raise funds to endure until the outcome of the main lawsuit in the United States and domestic courts come out. It is known that the company has recently succeeded in receiving some funds through attracting angel investment, but it is expected that it will be virtually difficult to raise additional funds if it does not win in the provisional disposition. If IronMace claim is cited, so if IronMace wins, it is predicted that a breakthrough will be found in the form of direct service of Dark and Darker. In this case, it is predicted that it will attract additional funds, and it will be relatively easy. Attracting additional funds will be relatively easy. Now, you can read this in the article I've linked in the description, but what does this really establish, and what does this really mean for the U.S. court case? So, the Korean case can have a major impact on the U.S. case for several reasons. This is all the stuff that can happen if IronMace wins their injunction in Korea. Early access would almost immediately move forward in Korea. Dark and Darker could gain investors because of the movement on their case, giving them more money. They were in talks with Tencent and NetEase to license Dark and Darker out to them for publication in China, which would be a huge amount of money, an insane amount of money. Nexon might be forced to stop sending DMCA notices entirely. That means that IronMace might be able to get back up on Steam. It really depends on how the U.S. courts interpret the ruling in Korea. But Nexon will assuredly fight for an injunction to take place in U.S. courts to prevent them from releasing in the US, especially on Steam. And that's even if they do lose the injunction in Korea. But there's already a low chance of that being granted intact. If they do get an injunction in the US, regardless of what happens in Korea, that chances of that is pretty low. And if one is granted, it's probably going to be very heavily modified, as I explained in my last video. But if IronMace wins their injunction in Korea, pretty much all hope for any injunction against them in Korea or US is thrown out the window. It's pretty much dead. It will also greatly improve IM's chance of having their own injunction against Nexon approved in the United States as well, meaning that Nexon would have to stop sending DMCAs. They would have to, by law, stop sending DMCAs in the US, and they could get relisted on Steam immediately. That would be huge. Now, the other side of this is if Nexon wins their injunction in Korea, early access would be on hold until IM could appeal the decision in a higher court. Korea has a 3-stage legal system. It's lower court, appeals court, Supreme Court, at least to the best of my knowledge. So they would have to go through all three systems. If there's an initial, the way that would work is basically if there's an initial injunction placed against IronMace, IronMace could then take it to, in the lower court, IronMace can then take it to appeals. And then if that decision is overturned in the appeals court, Nexon would have to take it forward to the Supreme Court. Now, if IronMace lost in lower court and appeals court, the case is over. And the same thing happens with the IM injunction if they get theirs. If IronMace injunction goes forward, Nexon can take it to appeals court. If Nexon takes it to appeals and they lose there, game over, IronMace wins in Korea. If they win there, IronMace can then take it to Supreme Court, and then whoever wins that wins in general. Nexon gets their injunction, IronMace will not be able to take investments for Dark and Darker in Korea, and that's where they're primarily located. So no more funding. And IronMace might be forced to stop development on all Dark and Darker related activities in Korea entirely, and that's where their development team is. So that would effectively halt Dark and Darker from this point onward, unless the injunction is heavily modified or IronMace straight up move to another country. So it can impact a lot of stuff. Now, what do I think will happen? To be honest, I don't know yet. It's really hard to say. I don't know enough about the Korean law or previous cases outside of the Blue Hole versus NCSoft case, and I went over that in a previous video. But I am still cautiously optimistic that Nexon's injunction request will either get thrown out entirely or it will be heavily modified, just because of everything that I've heard and seen about previous cases up till this point. It just doesn't seem likely that Nexon's injunction request goes through in full. It just really doesn't. There's just too much on the line and at risk, and there's already public expectations, and there's already been a big part of this is there's already been investment. So there's already hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line, right, from both Nexon and IronMace. So granting either side a full injunction against the other at this point would kind of not make sense. So I think that modified injunctions, if anything, is kind of the way forward, the safest thing to assume will happen. Another part of my reasoning for this is that there's been an ongoing legal case against Mr. Choi for nearly 2 years for exactly what they're accusing IM of in their injunction request, yet there's still no decision. And I consulted a buddy of mine who lives in Korea. He's an author, but I won't name names. According to a friend of mine that lives in Korea, the publicly available news about the case is mixed, right? Some publications have claimed that no evidence has been found, and Nexon is basically dragging this case out just to hurt Mr. Choi. Others are taking Nexon's side about this and saying that the case is a slam dunk for Nexon, and IronMace is going to win against, or Nexon's going to win against IronMace and Mr. Choi. So it's kind of hard to know what's true unless we have proof from the courts, and that's proof I don't have access to. So if anybody does know Korean lawyers who have access to court records, send them to me, because I would love to talk with them. But for now, again, I remain cautiously optimistic that IM will win the injunction battle in the US and in Korea. From everything I've looked at and what we know from Blue Hole and NCSoft, this thing is leaning in IM's favor very heavily. Unfortunately, Mr. Choi himself might be in some legal trouble, but that's another story that I've already gone over in another video. So the TLDR on the Korean court case is, what I just said. IronMace filed for a Korean injunction back when Nexon filed their DMCA, asking for Nexon to stop interfering with their business. Today, Nexon asked for an injunction in Korea to ban IronMace from directly concluding the services of Dark and Darker, and that happened in Korea. I don't think much will come from either injunction, and remain cautiously optimistic that IAM will win that fight. Either way, we should know by the end of July to early August. Now, let's move on to where we stand in the US. This section is much shorter, and it's kind of just a correction of the video I posted a few days ago. Simply put, we don't really know for sure what's going on, and I may have been wrong. Kind of. So, for now, no new information has popped up on Pacer or any other US court filing system. There's three things. Pacer's behind. The timeline I gave in my last video is slightly off, which is the most likely. Or IronMace hasn't filed a reply, in which case they lose in the United States. Pacer's never really behind. Like, usually 48 hours is the longest I think I've seen it take to update. And then IM will not miss their deadline. I guarantee that. So the timeline I gave in my last video is probably slightly off. And here's why. Early on in my assessment of where we are in this court case, my original timeline counted the affidavit of service of summons and complaint as the official date of service. This was 5/30/23. That's when that affidavit was filed. However, I was told this is wrong and I'm dumb by some Reddit lawyer, and I listened to those people and, according to them, corrected my timeline. So what's happening now, and the reason why we haven't seen anything on Pacer, leads me to believe that the courts have denied 5/23/23 as the official date of service. And I think that they are going forward with 5/30/23 as I originally thought. So 5/30/23 is when the affidavit of service of summons and complaint. This was filed and entered on 5/30/23. This is Pacer. Here's the case. Michelle L. Peterson presiding. The filing dates, the last filing date was 5/30/23. I looked this up today. I've been checking every day. And it was entered 5/30/2020, or the order of motion of miscellaneous relief, and when they actually served them in the when Nexon served IronMace in the United States happened on 5/23/23. That's the date I was using. I'm fairly certain this 5/30/23 date is the actual date, because that's when the courts recognized that all parties had been served in Korea and the United States, and that's directly from Pacer. That's a legal court document, official from the government. So moving forward, that is the date I'm going to be using, unless proven otherwise, because that is the date all four parties, IronMace, IronMace's lawyer, Terrence himself, and Mr. Choi, were all served, and their service was officially received and documented by the court on that date. This includes their locations both in Korea and in the US. So basically, it makes it so instead of 6/14/23 end of business day, it's now end of business day on 6/20/23. Just pushes it back by 6 days. 6/21, because it would be 7 days. So it pushes it back to 6/21/23. End of business days. So, because it pushes it back 7 days. If true, we should have new information by then on 6/21/23 at the absolute latest. And that's when we should get word that there's either an extension or they filed their reply/appearance. If they file an extension on or before the 21st, we'll probably get early access as soon as possible, like I said in my last video. If not, we can expect to wait until about 7/21/23 for more news about early access, which coincidentally coincides with the Korean timeline. If you remember from earlier in the video, that's when we're kind of expected to see what happens with the injunctions in Korea. So everything can be kind of wrapped up for early access in Korea and in the US by 7/21/23. Everything should be much more clear by mid to end of July at the latest, unless IronMace surprises me and risks pissing off the judge by releasing early access without the court's input and doesn't file for an extension and throws up early access anyway. That's highly unlikely, but it might happen. So moving forward, Pacer updates usually within 24 to 48 hours, and I'll have access to that information as soon as possible afterwards. I will always do my best to give everyone as much information as possible as soon as I can. I also promise to always correct any information that is false or proven inaccurate. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just some dude with a bunch of nerd lawyer friends who's trying to sift through as much information as I possibly can. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, sorry I was misled on the original date, but the timeline is now 6/21/23, and then that would push the early case conference back to 7/21/23. Yeah, that's about as much information on the U.S. case that I have. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm doing the best I can to keep on top of everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ask questions in the comment. If you want to stay ahead, please consider joining my Patreon and the Discord. That's where I get that's where I have all the behind the scenes info, including my video scripts and game dev info as soon as it happens. So what I do is I usually write a script like the one you're looking at, and then I'll record it like I'm doing now. But before I post the video and record it, I post this to Patreon, so you'll know anywhere from a day to 2 days in advance, or anywhere from a few hours to a few days in advance of when I post a video. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you have an amazing day. Stay patient and hold the line.